Anne Frank was born on June 12, 1929 in Frankfurt, Germany to parents Edith and Otto with her older sister Margot. Despite being liberal Jews, the family didn't always follow the standard traditions of Judaism, though they did live in a community of Jews and some non-Jewish folk, so there was a local variety of religion in their area. Edith was much closer to her children while Otto focused more on work, though both encouraged their children to read. In 1933, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party won the federal election. The family then moved to Amsterdam in the Netherlands after Otto received an offer to start his own business. The Franks were only one family among 300,000 other Jews who fled from Germany between 1933 and 1939. As they grew and started school, Margot was really gifted with maths while Anne was more into reading and writing, though the latter would always remain extremely private about what she wrote, not showing anyone. The Second World War unfortunately began in 1939, but it wasn't until May the following year when Germany invaded the Netherlands and Jews began to be executed due to the discriminatory laws. Otto had plans to relocate the family to the United States as he felt it was the safest, but his visa was never processed due to the US closing their consulate in Rotterdam and losing much of their paperwork. However, even if it was processed, the US government were weary about people from Germany secretly being Nazi spies, and it's unlikely it would have been accepted anyway. On Anne's 13th birthday on June 12, 1942, she was given a book that she had spotted in a shop window just a few days prior and had requested. It was technically an autograph book, but Anne opted to use it as her own personal diary instead. Her first entry came just 2 days later, listing all of the restrictions to Jews that were being implemented in her local area at the time. The Frank parents decided to go into hiding with the children on July 16, 1942, but Margot received a notice to send her to work camp, so they decided to move the date 10 days forward. Anne gave some friends and neighbours some keepsakes before the family moved into their famous hiding place on July 6, 1942. It was in the building of Otto's company where some of his most trusted employees could help them in secret. There was a 3-story hidden space above the landing, and it would forever be known as the secret annex. The family intentionally left their apartment in complete shambles to make it look like they ran away in a hurry, even leaving a note implying they fled to Switzerland. They even had to leave Anne's pet cat behind, and things were so restricted, not only did they have to go to a Jew-only school, but Jews weren't allowed to even use public transport, so they had to walk several kilometers from their home. Their hiding place was even covered by a bookcase to make it even more difficult to locate. The only employees of Otto's that were aware of their hiding place was Victor Kugler, Johannes Kleiman, Miep Gies and Bert Viscaigel. Miep's husband Jan and Viscaigel's father Johannes were also aware and aided them during their hiding. The only connection the family would have of the outside world would simply be the employees updating them on the war and any political developments. Their friends provided them with food, which grew more and more difficult as time went on, but Anne did write that they were also great at helping them with morale. If these employees were caught, they too could face the death penalty for sheltering Jews. They were literally risking their entire lives for them. Life became even more confined when on July 13, 1942, the Franks were joined by another family, the Van Pels, Herman, Auguste, and their 16-year-old son Peter. Just a few months later, a friend of the family, a dentist, Fritz Pfeffer, also joined the fray, but Anne actually enjoyed having new people to talk to at first, though it didn't last very long. Due to the confined conditions, tensions quickly rose. Anne had to share a room with Peter and soon found him intolerable and hated having no privacy of her own. She also clashed with his mother August, who she found idiotic. She also found Herman and Fritz both selfish as they ate far too much food for themselves. However, she did eventually grow rather fond of Peter in the end, even beginning a slight romance. She even received her first ever kiss from the boy, but she was unsure if the feelings for him were genuine or just because they were forced to live in such close proximity. She also became good friends with their colleagues who were helping them out. She often looked forward to their visits, especially from Bep, who was a typist and fellow writer. In her diary, Anne actually claimed that she was a lot closer with her father than her mother. Once the diary was discovered, Otto confessed that he got on better with Anne than Margot, who was closer with her mother, and he felt it was because Margot rarely showed her feelings and didn't need as much support, whereas Anne did and suffered from many mood swings. The sisters were really close, however, even before going into hiding, though Anne was sometimes jealous of Margot as she was sometimes criticised for not being as gentle and sensitive. On January the 12th, 1944, Anne wrote that her and Margot were growing a lot closer. She felt like she was now treating her as more of an adult than just her baby sister who didn't matter, but she was still having issues with her mother. She claimed that she just couldn't confront her with anything, and even wrote that she wasn't a mother to her. In later entries, however, Anne did take it back and showed regret for her harsh attitude, admitting that there was fault on both sides. She soon after began to show her mother a lot more respect. Most of Anne's time in hiding was spent on reading and studying. Both girls wanted to return to school, so they kept up to date with their work, but Anne really opened up with her diary, writing about things that she just couldn't confide to anybody else. She showed great maturity and intelligence for such a young age, writing many motivational and inspiring quotes still used to this day. She wrote about her beliefs in God and human nature and just her own life aspirations. I finally realised that I must do my schoolwork to keep from being ignorant, to get on in life, to become a journalist, because that's what I want. I know I can write, but it remains to be seen whether I really have talent. And if I don't have the talent to write books or newspaper articles, I can always write for myself. But I want to achieve more than that. I can't imagine living like Mother, Mrs. Van Daan, and all the women who go about their work and are then forgotten. I need to have something besides a husband and children to devote myself to. I want to be useful or bring enjoyment to all people, even those I've never met. I want to go on living even after my death. And that's why I'm so grateful to God for having given me this gift, which I can use to develop myself and to express what's inside me. When I write, I can shake off all my cares. My sorrow disappears, my spirits are revived. But that's a big question. Will I ever be able to write something great? Will I ever become a journalist or a writer? Anne continued to write regularly, portraying the true hardships of remaining a secret for so long. They weren't able to use the restroom during the day in case any of the workers downstairs heard the pipes. Any slight movement would blow their cover. Most days they had to sit completely still. Any movement could have been heard by the workers below and would have given them up instantly. And they had to be extremely careful near any window at any time. They remained hidden for 779 days, which is 2 years, 1 month, and 18 days in complete isolation from the outside world. Anne's last diary entry was August 1st, 1944. Just 3 days later, the building was stormed by a group of German uniformed police officers. The Franks, Van Pels and Pfeffer were marched out and taken away for interrogation. On August 5th, they were transferred to House van Bewering, translated as House of Detention, which is an overcrowded prison. Just 2 days later, they were transported again to Westerbork transit camp, where more than 100,000 Jews, most of which were Dutch or German, had died. Because they were in hiding and then arrested, they were now criminals and sent to the punishment barracks for hard labour. Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman were jailed at the penal camp, though Kleiman was released after 7 weeks. Kugler, however, wasn't as lucky, as he was held in various concentration camps until the war was over. Miep Gies and Bep Verskygel were questioned and threatened by police, but not detained. They returned to the office the next day, and that's when they discovered Anne's diary, as well as several family photo albums. They vowed to return them to Anne once the war had passed. On August 7th, 1944, Gies actually tried to fight for their release, offering money in exchange, but was turned down. On September 3rd, they were all deported to the infamous Auschwitz concentration camp. The journey alone took 3 days. Once arrived, Otto was taken away from his family, as the women and children had to be separated from the men. If they were deemed fit to work, they were sent into the camp. If not, they were instantly murdered. There were 1,019 passengers. 549 of those, including children who were all younger than 15, were sent directly to the gas chambers to be killed. Anne Frank, who had turned 15 just 3 months prior, was actually spared, but she learned about the gassing and instantly assumed that her father was killed as soon as they were separated. She was forced to strip naked to be disinfected, her head was shaved, and she had an ID number tattooed on her arm. All women were used as slaves, and Anne was forced to haul rocks and dig, and at night they were crammed into overcrowded barracks. There are conflicting reports during the stage. Some say that Anne became weak, crying whenever children were taken to the gas chambers, but others claimed that she remained strong and brave throughout. One thing's for certain, Anne was at least confident enough to be able to get extra bread rations for her mother, sister and herself, though disease was spreading and her skin became badly infected by scabies. Her and Margot were soon moved into an infirmary which was constantly pitch black and infested with rats and mice. Edith starved herself, refusing to eat, so every tiny crumb could go to her daughters instead. She would pass them rations through a hole that she had made in the bottom of the infirmary wall. In October of 1944, they were all scheduled to be relocated relocated to the Labau labour camp, but Anne was prohibited due to her skin condition, and her mother and sister chose to stay with her. On October the 8th, 1944, women were being moved to Bergen Belsen. There were 8,000 of them, which included August van Pels and Anne and Margot Frank, who were forced to leave their mother behind, who sadly died from starvation. The Van Pels were also separated when the men and women were split apart, but Herman, Peter and August were able to see each other during the evenings before they were transported on September the 3rd, 1944, shoved into a cramped cattle car with everyone else to Auschwitz. During this journey, Herman and Peter stayed together, but August was taken away from them. Herman and Peter were deemed fit enough to work and were spared the gas chamber, so they did road construction along with Otto Frank and Fritz Pfeffer. Herman did end up injuring his hand and was allegedly sent to die in the chambers in October of 1944 at the age of 46. Fritz Pfeffer, like the other men, was well enough to do hard labour, having to build roads, but then he had to leave Auschwitz in November of 1944, ending up in the Neuengamme concentration camp. They were forced to do hard labour under extremely poor conditions before Fritz passed away on December the 20th, 1944, via enterocolitis, which is a gastrointestinal infection. After being torn away from her family, August did have the support of Edith Frank, Margot and Anne herself. She was transported with them both on November the 1st, 1944 to the Bergen Belsen concentration camp, which was incredibly overcrowded. The number of prisoners was growing at an alarming rate. More tents were hoisted up, but diseases were spreading continuously. Anne was actually briefly reunited with two of her friends, but by this point she was bald, extremely thin, weak, and shivering constantly. August was still with them, however, and was consistently tending to Margot, who was so sick and weak she couldn't even leave her bed. Anne had given up at this point, claiming that she believed her parents were dead and she no longer wanted to continue living. In early 1945, a typhus epidemic spread throughout the camp, killing 17,000 prisoners, including Anne Frank. However, at the time, other diseases such as typhoid fever were around, so it's not possible to determine when or what specifically killed her, though it's mostly believed to have been the epidemic. The disease was killing inmates like flies, just pouring in. People would be told that 300 Jews had died, and they would be grateful that it was only 300. It's reported that Anne died just a few days after her sister. Margot allegedly fell from her bunk in a weakened state and was killed by the shock. The dates are unknown, but it's believed that it was just a few weeks before British soldiers actually liberated the camp on April the 15th, 1945, though others believe it could have been as early as February. Some witnesses stated that Anne showed symptoms of the disease on February the 7th, and untreated victims usually died within 12 days of their first symptoms. After the camp was liberated, it was then burned to try to prevent the disease spreading further, and Anne and Margot were both buried in a mass grave, but it's unsure exactly where. Around the same time the Frank sisters passed away, August was put on yet more transport, ending up in the Ragen concentration camp, but she only remained there for a few weeks before being moved to Theresienstadt. There's conflicting reports, some stating that August passed away during this journey from typhus, though others claimed that the Germans literally took August off of the train and threw her under it at the age of 42. But there's only one witness to this claim and nobody else backed it up, so it's most likely false. Anne's boyfriend Peter was unbelievably strong during this entire ordeal. Otto Frank tried to convince him several times to hide in the barracks, but Peter refused, believing that he was fit enough to be able to survive. Sadly, however, American troops liberated the concentration camps on May the 5th, 1945. But Peter ended up passing away just 5 days later due to sickness at the age of just 18 years old. After the war ended, it's believed that only 5,000 Jews out of the 107,000 deported from the Netherlands actually survived. Amazingly, however, Anne and Margot's father, Otto Frank, actually survived his horrific ordeal in Auschwitz. Once the war was over, he returned to Amsterdam, desperate to relocate his family. He was given a home by Jan and Miep Gies before being informed of his wife's death. He did, however, remain hopeful that his two daughters had made it out okay, but just a few weeks later, he learned the harsh truth. He became determined to try to find out what happened to them, but heard about all of the murders before Miep presented Otto with his youngest daughter's diary and some loose notes that she found with it. He read the entire thing and admitted that he had absolutely no clue that Anne documented so much during their time of desperation. He struggled to even read the whole thing, as Anne wrote some personal things that he genuinely had no idea about. He felt like he didn't really know her after all, but he was particularly moved by her dreams of becoming a journalist or an author. He wanted to make it happen, regardless of her death. Otto submitted her diary to be published, but some sections were altered, adding fictional characters and changing a lot of Anne's words. So now there were two versions of the book. Otto edited certain passages and removed her criticisms of her own parents and her open admittance of her puberty and sexuality. The diary failed to be published a few times, but was finally done so with the correct original version in 1947, before being printed more times by 1950. It began to be released worldwide, but flopped in the UK, though in Japan it sold more than 100,000 copies. It didn't take long for Anne Frank to become a worldwide cultural and historical figure. It even led to a play in New York City on October the 5th, 1955, which ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize for drama, and several film adaptations followed. It even began being used and taught in schools as part of the history curriculum, spreading Anne's name further. President John F. Kennedy even used her as an inspirational figure during a 1961 speech. Even Nelson Mandela claimed the book got him through his times in prison, though it wasn't all wine and roses. In 1957, once the diary had been universally loved, the National League of Sweden published an article questioning the book's authenticity, accusing novelist May Levin of writing the diary, while others claimed Otto wrote it himself and tried to pass it off as his daughter's work. In 1958, the play was being performed when a bunch of protesters picketed the show, claiming that Anne never actually existed to begin with and they needed proof, by finding the man who actually arrested her. This actually was done, but not until 1963, when Carl Silberbauer was found. He was questioned and was able to identify Anne from a photograph as one of the family members he arrested, giving very detailed accounts of her capture which matched witnesses' statements, including Otto Frank. In 1959, it didn't stop. Otto had to take legal action against Lothar Stylau, who was a school teacher, publishing articles also calling the diary a forgery. It wasn't dropped until 1960, when the court matched the diary to letters written by Anne to confirm her handwriting. It would still continue in 1976 against Hans Rother Frankfurt, who confirmed that it was a forgery. He was threatened with 500,000 German marks and a 6-month jail sentence if he continued the slander. Roth did appeal this decision, but would then pass away in 1978 and the case was dropped. Otto Frank died in 1980, but he did leave the deleted sections of the diary with Cornelis Sujic, the president of the US Center for Holocaust Education Foundation. In 1995, some sections were put back in, with her discussing her own genitalia and her bewilderment about sex and childbirth, and in 1999 the sections about her disdain towards her parents were also re-added. However, not long after Otto died, forensic experts studied the diary to check that the paper, glue and ink were all genuinely available during the time it was supposedly written, and came to the conclusion that it was in fact authentic. Amazingly, it still continued in 1991, where Robert Forresson and Siegfried Verbeek produced a book continuing the allegation that Otto wrote the diary himself. They claimed that the handwriting and just general vocabulary and attitude did not match those of a young teenager, and that hiding in that annex for so long would have been impossible. In 1993, the Anne Frank house filed a lawsuit to prohibit any further distribution of the book, and in 1998 it was finally passed. Anne's legacy lives on to this day. In fact, on May 3rd, 1957, a group of locals, which included Otto Frank, rescued the office building from being demolished and wanted to open it to the public. On May 3rd, 1960, it finally happened. It was all unfurnished, so visitors can just explore the rooms, but other genuine things were left in, like photographs Anne had stuck to the walls, and markings where Otto measured the heights of his daughters. Otto Frank soon remarried, and in 1963, he and his second wife set up a foundation called the Anne Frank Fonds in Switzerland to raise money for whatever cause they can, and the Anne Frank Museum is one of the most popular and most visited museums in the world, even to this day. However, the person who gave away the Franks' whereabouts has never been identified. Although one night there was a burglary at the premise in April of 1944, and a night watchman and a police officer actually did discover the bookcase with all of the hidden Jews behind, but had no idea they were there and left without incident. Despite a handful of trusted employees knowing about their hiding, all of them denied ever betraying the families and maintained this to their graves. But let's look at the evidence. As mentioned previously, during the burglary investigation in April 1944, the night watchman who investigated, Martin Sleegers, did actually fumble around with the bookcase, and it may be possible that he discovered the hiding place but didn't reveal it until later. One suspect is Tony Ahlers, who is a member of the National Socialist movement in the Netherlands. Carol Ann Lee, who helped Otto with the publication of the book, accused him of doing so. Rewinding to April of 1941, Ahlers had visited Otto in his office to confront him about some letter regarding a former employee. Otto had expressed some negative views about this person, but Ahlers worked as a courier and had intercepted the letter by chance. It was, however, later exposed that he was not a courier and this was a lie, but Ahlers did make frequent visits to the security service, and Otto paid him off at least twice for unknown reasons. Ahlers was also known for being anti-Semitic. He was even convicted for this after the war. But he was also known for being a compulsive liar, making it difficult to distinguish any witness accounts from him. Some believe that he could have betrayed them personally, others believe he could have just passed the information on to the Nazi security service. Ahlers did start a business around this time similar to Otto's, which would have given him the access. He would have also been in contact with Willem van Maren, a stockroom manager who we'll talk about later. His wife at the time, Martha van Kuijk, was never interrogated, but some believe that she may have known some details as well. Another suspect is the aforementioned Willem van Maren, who the families really didn't trust. He always seemed inquisitive whenever people entered the stockroom after hours, and he often asked employees randomly if there had been a Mr. Frank working at the office. He often stole goods, and many believe he gave them to Tony Ahlers as well, maybe even providing him with information that he found inside the building. Lena Hartog was also accused by another biographer, Melissa Muller. She worked as the cleaner in the building, which she denied, but it was proven to be true, just beginning her contradicting claims. Her husband worked in the stockroom, but he too struggled to tell the truth, as he claimed that he continued to work after the families were arrested, but it was revealed that he ran away as soon as the arrest took place. She also allegedly accused another building of hiding Jews in, which remains unclear why or how she would think such a thing. She was also scared for her husband's safety, working in a building where Jews were hiding, but then surely she would have warned her husband on the day of the arrest, and she never did. And most of these suspects knew each other, and it's possible that they may have worked together. Nearly all of them were interrogated after the war, but nobody was ever identified as the culprit. It wasn't until 2015 when Flemish journalist Jorin de Bruijn and Joop van Wyk, son of Bep Verschijgel, wrote a biography and accused Bep's younger sister Nelly of betraying the Jews. There was an incident where Nelly phoned the German police force, the Gestapo, on the morning on August 4th, 1944 when they were captured. She had always been critical of Bep and their father Johannes Verschijgel helping the Jews. To make matters worse, Nelly had also worked with the Nazis between the age of 19 and 23. Karl Sibauer, who arrested the families, admitted they got the phone call giving them the anonymous tip, and the voice sounded like a young woman. A year later, the Anne Frank house published new research which considered the fact that the families may have just gone over their rations of food, or there were activities with Otto's company that led the Nazis there. As time went on, the families became a lot less careful. Curtains were left open more than just a crack as previously done, rooftop windows were accidentally left open, they were less careful making noises. It's perfectly possible that an observant outsider could have just noticed and realised that there were clearly people inside the building after office hours. They considered other possibilities for them being discovered, but it doesn't rule out betrayal. So who ratted them out? Did the Franks, the Van Pels and Pfeffer just make a mistake and pay for it with their lives? Did one of their most trusted friends betray them? Or was it just an outsider who gave their whereabouts away? Anne Frank has become a worldwide phenomenon for the past 74 years, and we are still seeking answers.